In the book of 1 Samuel, the people of Israel reject God as their king and beg to have their own king, just like the nations around them. And so God relents, and through Samuel appoints the king Saul from the tribe of Benjamin. And Saul is king over Israel for, if I recall, it's about 40 years. Yet, for the majority of that time, Saul was not pleasing in the sight of the Lord. He was not pleasing because Saul was not faithful. And God had Samuel anoint a man to be king over Israel, a man after his own heart, a man many of us know as King David. Now, as God was bringing David to a position of authority and power in Israel, he used Saul to do so. And Saul, not being a fool, realized that the Spirit of the Lord was with David in all that he did. And as David went out and did battle on behalf of the Lord, he grew in stature while Saul diminished. This displeased King Saul very much, so much so that he made it his mission to kill David. And it was at this time that David fled from Naioth at Ramah and went to Jonathan, the son of Saul, whom David loved, and asked, "What is it that I have done? What is my crime? How have I wronged your father that he is trying to kill me?" "Never," Jonathan replied. "You are not going to die. Look, my father, he doesn't do anything, whether great or small, without letting me know. Why would he hide this from me? If he was trying to kill you, David, why wouldn't he tell me? It just isn't so." But David took an oath and said, "Your father knows very well that I have found favor in your eyes, and he has said to himself, 'I can't tell Jonathan my plans. I can't tell Jonathan that I'm going to kill David, or he will be grieved.'" David continued, "Yet as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, there is only a step between me and death." Jonathan, in despair, said to David, "Whatever you want me to do, I'll do for you." So David concocts a plan. There's a festival, and he tells Jonathan, "Go to the festival. And if your father asks where I am, tell him that my family was offering a sacrifice on behalf of the clan, and I had to be there. If he says, 'Very well,' then you know that I am safe. But if he gets angry, if he gets upset, if it throws him into a rage, then you know he is trying to kill me." Jonathan, very upset at the prospect of his father and David at war with one another, proclaimed, "Never! If I had the least inkling that my father was determined to harm you, wouldn't I tell you?" David asked, "Who will tell me if your father answers harshly?" Jonathan said, "Fine. I swear by the Lord, the God of Israel, that I will surely sound out my father by this time the day after tomorrow. If he is favorably disposed towards you, I will not send you word. Will I not send you word and let you know? But if my father intends to harm you, if he intends to kill you, may the Lord, our God, Yahweh, the covenant God of Israel, deal with Jonathan ever so severely, if I do not let you know and send you away in peace. May the Lord, the God of Israel, may the Lord, the God of Israel, be with you as he has been with my father. But show me unfailing, fragrant, loyal love, like the Lord's unfailing, fragrant, loyal love, as long as I live, so that I may not be killed. And do not ever cut off your fragrant, unfailing love from my family. Not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth." So on that day, Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, May the Lord call David's enemies to account. And Jonathan had David reaffirm his oath out of love for him, because he loved him as he loved himself. We've been moving through the character of God, and we talked about all of these wonderful character traits that God says of himself in Exodus 34, 6 and 7. This is on the mountain after the people of Israel have horribly sinned before the Lord, and he says, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children up to the third and fourth generations. As we're moving through this series, we're now on abounding in love. And really, these make a unit. There's actually four major units in this. Compassionate and gracious always go together. Slow to anger always stands on its own. But abounding in love and faithfulness always work together. This morning, we're going to talk about what it means that God abounds in love. So what is this love? Surprisingly enough, it's actually rather difficult to translate. If you look at this passage in the New International Version, it merely says abounding in love. But if you look in the ESV, the English Standard Version of the Bible, it will say he is steadfast in love. And if you look in the New American Standard, it says he has loving kindness. If you look in the Message, it merely translates it as so much love. When you start to see this variation among the English translations, that should cue us in that this is a very difficult word to translate. It encompasses much more than what we would normally think of love. It encompasses much more than what our society currently believes is love. After all, our society right now believes that you can't love someone and tell them they're wrong. You can't love someone and say, I disagree with you. In our society, if you don't affirm every single one of my decisions, accept me with who I claim to be, then you don't love me. Church, that isn't love. It isn't love. So we don't even understand what simple love is. This concept is even more so. It's even more difficult. You see, God's love is fragrant and loyal. You'll have noticed several times as I moved through that text in 1 Samuel chapter 20, I said that he had fragrant, loyal love multiple times. The reason for that is all of these things encompass what this love really is, and yet the NIV translates it as simple kindness. Kindness in our society does not encompass what this word means. This love, this abounding in love, this love that Jonathan and David have for one another is, first of all, only experienced within covenant. Now, if you're on my Wednesday night class, you're very familiar with the term covenant. We've gone over a lot of covenants. We've talked about this ad nauseum, but if you're not, a covenant is like a divine contract or an agreement. Sometimes God makes these agreements with man, and man has no part in them. Think of the covenant that God made with Noah, right? Noah doesn't have any part in the covenant. God is merely saying, by my own power, by my own authority, I will never again flood the earth. There's nothing for Noah to do. So this is in covenant. And not in all covenants does man have a part that he's supposed to play, or an expectation, or an obligation. In other covenants, though, we see that man does play a part. For example, the covenant at Sinai and the covenant we have in Christ. There are expectations in both of these covenants. There are parts that we play. This love that God has, this abounding love that he has, is only expressed within the confines of covenant. It's only expressed to those who are in covenant relationship with him. Yet this love is not solely an act of obligation. For example, If you go to the hospital, a nurse will come and check your vital signs. They will come and check on you, see how you're doing. They'll come and give reports to the doctors, right? She has a contractual, or he has a contractual obligation to see to your well-being as a patient. But you'd be quite mistaken if you thought that that nurse loves you. She's doing her job. Yet the husband who cares for his sick wife day after day, week after week, month after month into year, who bathes her and cleans her, washes her and feeds her, changes her bedding, moves her from side to side. Anyone who's been in the medical field knows you can't just leave a patient laying in a bed. You've got to move them around. This husband who does this isn't getting anything in return. He loves his wife, and he's practicing this love within an obligation. That obligation is marriage. This is the type of love that God has for us. His love is this love that a husband has for a sick wife. Further, it's a love in obligation that demands action. It's not a love that sits on a couch and says, yeah, I love you. What do you want? That isn't love. It's a love that excitedly springs forward like a new husband and a wife, like newlyweds. Have you ever seen these people? They can't keep their hands off each other, right? They're constantly together and holding hands, and the love just drips off of them, and all of us go, oh my gosh, give it 10 years. This is disgusting. Give it 10 years. Wake up on that person in your bed for 10 years and see how you feel, right? See if you still love them that same way. This is what's awesome about our God's love that's expressed in this obligation, that's expressed in this covenant. It's as deep as the husband who comes to his wife day after day after day, caring for her, not expecting anything in return, but it's as fresh and young as newlyweds. It's a love that leaps with joy at the mere sight of the other. The love God has for his covenant people never grows old. God's love is exciting, it's beautiful, it's fragrant, it's pleasing and wonderful. This is the love that God has for his people. But it further also embodies the best sense of the saying, blood is thicker than water. I don't know about you, but I roll my eyes a bit when I hear that. Do you? Do you roll your eyes? Oh my gosh, blood is thicker than water. Why do we do that? Because maybe like you and I, we've experienced family members who use that to back us into a corner, right? Well, if you really love me, don't you know blood is thicker than water? You should do X, Y, Z for me. You see, as a culture and as a society, we abuse such sentiment. We wish it were true. We wish blood is thicker than water, but ultimately in our experiences, what we normally find is that those who would be quick to profess that are also quick to abandon it. But our God's love embodies the very best sense of this idea. While our families are rarely what they should and could be, this love of God characterizes the very best. To God, we are his blood, and he is ready to ride and die for his people. This is the exact love that David had for Jonathan, and Jonathan for David. They loved each other deeply, and in a sense, it's a bond. This type of bond can only be known by those who are very, very close within a family, or in my experience, those who have served in the military, those who have seen combat. Our police officers who go into dangerous and desperate situations. It's a love that is willing to lay down your life for the other person. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Sounds a lot like what Christ did for us. Ultimately, this beautiful love that God has for his people is supremely loyal. The fact is, this love encompasses all of these things and gets exercised and translated throughout the scriptures as love, kindness, mercy, devotion, approval, unfailingly loyal. God's love for his people is all of these things. You can imagine why the translators have such a difficult time translating this word from the Hebrew, because it embodies such a wide range of awesome things. Yet even though this love is ultimately God's to express, we see it expressed in his followers. In Joshua chapter 2, here the NIV translates this concept as kindness, but when the spies come into the land and they move into Jericho, and the people are looking for them, Rahab brings the spies into her house. She hides them up in the upper room. The king's men come and knock at the door. We know the Jews were here. The Israelites, they were here. They're spying out the land. Send them out. And Rahab goes, no, they were here, but they left and they went somewhere else. Rahab goes to the spies and she tells them, she says, I know that the Lord has given you this land and that a great fear of you has fallen on all of us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear. You see, the people of the land knew the mighty works that God had performed on behalf of the Israelites. They were aware of the mighty hand that Yahweh God brought the Jews up out of Egypt. They were aware of the crossing of the Red Sea, and they were terrified because they all knew that their God was God of heaven and earth. They knew it. And yet, despite this knowledge, it is only Rahab and her family that turn and seek the Lord. They turn towards him and side with God over their own culture. She hides the spies and she lets them out the window down the cord. But before she does, she tells them, now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show this loyal love, this fragrant loyal love to my family, because I have shown it to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death. What would you do to save your family? Rahab reaches out to total strangers, to a people that are not her own, and demonstrates a loyal love, protecting them and hiding them, even from her own people. And she is rewarded. In Joshua chapter 6, verse 25, it says, but Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. What's interesting about Rahab and really all of these examples is we'll see them in the line of Christ. Rahab, a prostitute, she's not an Israelite. She's in the line of Christ. But it's not only with Rahab. We also see this with Ruth and Naomi. During the time of the judges, this was prior to the time of the kings of Israel, there's a great famine in the land. And so Naomi and her family, her two sons and husband, they all move to Moab, a country near to Israel. They move there and they live there for 10 years. And yet Naomi and her sons and her husband, Naomi doesn't, but her sons and her husband all die. All that are left are Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah. I was terrified I was going to mispronounce that as Oprah. I did that a couple of times. Anyway, Ruth and Orpah. Now, these are three women living in ancient times. This is not conducive to a healthy life. This is not safe. And then so Naomi, when she hears that the Lord has returned to Israel, the famine has broken, says to her two daughters-in-law, go back each of you to your mother's home. May the Lord show you fragrant, loyal love, as you have shown fragrant, loyal love to your dead husbands and to me. You see, the fact is, what Orpah and Ruth had done, sticking with Naomi throughout this entire time, was something unprecedented, unheard of. Why would they stay with her? She's not going to have any more children. She's not going to have any more sons for them. If they stay with her, it's almost certain death. If not death, then destitution. And yet because of their obligation, they loved Naomi and stayed with her. But when Naomi makes the determination, I'm going to head back to Israel, I'm going to go back, she releases them from this vow and kisses them goodbye, and they wept aloud. Orpah turns and returns to her family. Now understand, what Orpah had done up until this point was amazing. The fact that she stayed as long as she did is just awesome. Awesome. If you have a mother-in-law, you know what I mean. That's a hard thing to do. But they did it. They did it. And then Ruth takes it even a step further. She says, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. And when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. It's a beautiful picture of God's abounding love. The degree to which He will pursue us, the degree to which He binds us to Him, is exactly what Ruth says to Naomi. What's interesting about the book of Ruth is we have two really awesome examples of this type of love. The first one is seen in Ruth. And because Ruth loves Naomi this way, and because Ruth puts herself in danger to travel all the way back to Bethlehem with Naomi, the people of Bethlehem learn of Ruth's passionate and fragrant and loyal love. In particular, one man learns of it. His name was Boaz. There are two pictures of God's love in the book of Ruth. The first is Ruth, and the second is Boaz. They both demonstrate it. And there's a whole lot that goes into that, but it's this beautiful picture of Boaz reaching out back in this fragrant and loyal love to a woman that he could do whatever he wants, and yet he chooses to be with Ruth. Ultimately, in this story, Naomi has really done nothing to deserve this devotion, and yet Ruth gives it anyway. It's an awesome picture of His love. The final example we have of this awesome, awesome love, surprisingly enough, is not David and Jonathan, although David and Jonathan do have it. You see, after Jonathan makes this oath with David, it won't be much longer until he falls in battle. God will come in, and Saul will die, and Jonathan will die with him, and David will never get to spend any time with Jonathan again. Yet after this time, David becomes king. And he asks a very curious question. He says in 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 1, is there anyone left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Is there anyone left? Is there no one left of the house of Saul? You see, God had made it His plan to destroy the house of Saul because of Saul's faithlessness. And yet David asks his men this question after he becomes king. And it turns out there is indeed one descendant left. Meshebeth. You know, I had that down. I think the Oprah and Orpah issue got to me. Mephibosheth. We're going to call him M, big M. I had it down. And then you get up here and you lose it, you know. Huh? Mephibosheth? Yeah, we're not going to call it Mephibosheth. It's Mephibosheth. See, there we go. I knew I could get it. You thank you for being patient. David finds out Mephibosheth is still alive. Now, the cool thing about Mephibosheth, he's lame. I guess that's not that cool, but he is lame. And he is the grandson of Jonathan. He's the only one left alive of Jonathan's life. And so David has him brought to Jerusalem. He restores Saul's land to him. He gives Saul's land back to this son, this great-grandson, grandson of Saul, son of Jonathan, this grandson of Saul. He gives him the land back, appoints servants over him, and gives him a seat at David's table. Now, what's the issue with this? Understand something. In the ancient world, what David just did is insane. Because this guy, I'm going to call him Big M. Big M here is a descendant of Saul. He has every right to the throne of Israel. David just took a man who could raise an army, who could raise the forces of the clan of Benjamin and come after him. He just took this man, gave him back all of his lands, gave him back all of his titles, and sits him at his own table. Why would David do such a thing? Why would David raise up someone who could be a threat to his throne? 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 12 through 13. It tells us Mephibosheth, this is going to be a constant thing, lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table. He was lame in both feet. 9:7. David says to him, "Don't be afraid, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." Again, that kindness. I will show you fragrant, loyal love for the sake of your father Jonathan. This is a rival to the throne, and yet David reaches out to him and blesses him with this awesome, abounding love. What does God do? Because he abounds with this fragrant, loyal love. We've seen 3 different pictures from 3 different people expressing this loyal love, this fragrant, loyal love one to the other. And this love that God has undergird and amplifies all of the other characteristics of God, and specifically directs them towards his covenant partners. This love is manifested as his compassion, or that deep, gut-wrenching concern for us, his people, and our well-being. So much so that when we suffer, even when it's entirely our own fault, God is moved to help us. It manifests itself as his graciousness, his overwhelming desire to bless us with gifts, especially when we do not deserve it. This love of God abounds in his long-suffering and patience. It's that ridiculous toleration of our abuses of him and his reckless pursuit of a people who habitually spurn God and cause him great suffering and sorrow. It undergirds his faithfulness. We're not going to talk about faithfulness that much today because next week I get to elaborate on faithfulness. So I'm not going to touch on it. But if you know the scriptures, if you know how God stood next to Abraham, you know how awesome his faithfulness is. This love is even manifested in his judgment. Because while God loves us and doesn't want to let us go, knowing that outside of him there is no peace, no rest, and ultimately no life. But rather, God will allow us to walk away from him because he loves us. In response to God's love, just like we saw in Rahab, Ruth, and David, God is determined to be merciful where no mercy is warranted. He is determined to forgive where no forgiveness is earned. He is determined to save even those who would fight against him, to redeem even those who would crucify him. Did Christ not say, "I have come to save the lost sheep of Israel," knowing full well that they were about to butcher him? And did he not say in the midst of that pain, and Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do? Ultimately, God's loyal love is seen in and through Christ. But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in transgressions. In Romans chapter 5, it says, even while we were yet enemies. In Ephesians 2, it has been grace. It is by grace you have been saved. And God raised us up with Christ and seated us with him in the heavenly realms in Christ Jesus. Church, this offer of Christ's love is open to you. But the only place we truly experience is in covenant. And the response that God expects of his people is that we turn around and demonstrate this same love, not to the world. This love is not reserved for the world. This love is reserved for the church. This is the love that we ought to show one to another. It is this type of love that John will say, a new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. And it's by this that the world will know that you are my disciples. So this morning, if you're out there and you've failed to have this type of love one for another and are in need of prayer, or if you're out there this morning and you're not in covenant relationship with God, you don't know how to be in covenant relationship with God, or you've never been asked to obey the gospel, I ask that you come as we stand and as we sing.